So in our last two presentations, we had a presentation by Mike Weiser about Avida Ed, which is an award-winning educational platform developed by Michigan State University, which they use in undergraduate courses to simulate, so undergraduates can simulate evolution in basically a petri dish where avidians can, which are different species of avidians, can compete against each other. And the students can vary resources that are available and things like that, pose their own questions and produce their own projects. We then heard from Professor Peter Nonax from UCLA, who talked to us about how he'd gamified basically and used games theory to construct his exams. So he did 4 different types of exams during a single quarter. He had students have a take-home and in-person exam. That was what the first type of test. So basically they took home the exam. Oh, and the questions were really difficult, really sort of not sort of, so the material that he would teach would be about it, but the questions would be adjacent to that material. And so he had students take home the question and then come in, and they could work as groups or not, and then they had to have memorized the exam, and they could have a scribe if they worked as a group. They had an exam where they could cheat, basically. Then the third exam, they had to write their own questions, and about 50% of the questions on the exam were students' questions, and they had to write questions that were similar to what Peter would write. And finally, he had a debate where the students would have to write an answer, one side of a debate that was currently happening in the literature, that was currently happening in science, and then Peter would pose a challenge to that, and then they would have to come up with another response to that challenge. And so that's a quick summary. Mike and Peter, please feel free to correct me as questions come if I've misrepresented your talks at all. But does anyone have any questions around those talks? Richard, if you, yeah.
Yes. So thanks. So right. So one question that sort of came to mind to me about this game theory approach is, do you run into the issue of having essentially paid ringers? So do you have students who will basically say, you pay me this amount, you can be on my team for 3 of these 4 things, I can pull you along, in which case at the end of the day, you don't know if the other teammates, so to speak, have in fact met your course objectives. Just as sort of a
I have no idea as to whether someone was like, offering their services for pay or anything along those lines. They could be, but I kind of doubt it. There's always a problem again of people who will basically take opportunities to just sort of float along and take advantage of us. And that's why I try, that's why I have 4 different kinds of tests, and some of them are easier to do that than others. And it is something you do sacrifice, I think, in doing this thing, is that maybe there's some small percentage of students who are getting a better grade than they ought to, but I'm willing to pay that price in terms of giving a better experience to the vast majority, again, of developing, I think, the ideas of critical thinking and so on. And it's an example from one of the tests I gave. It's not quite what you asked, but I think it's not too different. Was there's like a group of 4 students decided they were like the smartest in the class, and this was for the cheating test when they get the question when they walk into the classroom, right? And so they were going to separate themselves from everybody else, not share their answer, basically do well because they're like the smartest people in the class, and everybody else will do it. And so the question is given out, everybody starts doing it, and it was fantastic to see that this smart group suddenly realized that these larger groups working together were actually making far more progress on the question and doing it. And one by one, they defected and joined the larger group until all of them joined the larger group. So that sort of strategy of, hey, I'm the smartest guy in here, and I will, you know, for whatever benefits, drag some poor dummy along and so on. People realize that the smartest guy or gal is not as good as a group think, as individuals with different perspectives interacting and doing it. And very rapidly, it's sort of like, okay, I have to be part of that other one. But yeah, it is, and I forgot to sort of mention this, but by the end of the class, the students kind of realize that they've been in a game situation and they've had to come up with the rules for how they were going to do these tests, how they were going to go through my class. And they learn game theory by actually being part of a game. So again, yeah, it's not perfect. There always somebody will be getting more than they may actually deserve. But yeah, I'm willing to pay that price.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, if not, oh, Dilla, yep.
Sorry, I keep jumping in. Thank you both. I appreciated both of the talks. Peter, I had a question for you, especially about the debate part of things. I was curious if you could give us an example or two of what kind of debates were you encouraged? What were the debate questions? And the second part would be, how do you balance teaching of the material versus teaching critical thinking or teaching debating skills, sort of meta versus subject matter?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's not your classic debate, right? So it's debate in the sense that there's you know, alternative positions, and then you have to sort of respond to me pushing you at something. But it's not sort of like your classic debating skills of scoring, you know, rhetorical points and things like that. Well, just to sort of set it up a little bit. So usually what the last section of my course is on major evolutionary transitions. So the kind of my view of history of life from you know, the beginning to humans. And so well, one question that I would sort of pose is are humans a major evolutionary transition? And if they're not quite one yet, what is the next major evolutionary transition that could happen in the future? Or could another major evolutionary transition happen in the future? And you can argue that, I think, the key to doing is not giving a question where one side, you know, is like clearly right and the other is like struggling. A question like that could easily be argued that, yes, we're special. Yes, something, you know, we're heading towards some, you know, new form of biology or something like that. Or you could argue just as convincingly that no, we're you know, we're kind of slightly different apes, you know, and we're not heading towards any sort of grand new kind of life form. So that's the kind of question you have to sort of structure those questions that I think can be argued sort of both ways. Another one you could sort of say was like, okay, you know, in terms of natural selection, what is success? Dinosaurs, you know, ran the world for 100 million years. Were they successful? But they're not here anymore. So does that mean they're unsuccessful? Pro con, you know. So some kind of, you know, question where again it's not obvious that there is you know, one side has all the ammunition. And again, you allow the students to form groups of people that they might now know and interact. And you basically say, you know, you will need to defend your position against me. right? Not the other students. And that's the key, is it's never a contest against this group of students against that group of students. It's never like that. It's against the professor, always against the professor. And that means that you can even talk to the other side and get their view, and they will help you, and you will help them deal with me. So again, I think it gets people to interact, it gets people to cooperate. And like I say, and I should have said this before, is I don't have any actual data, right? So all I'm giving you is anecdotes. But it certainly seems to me the students enjoy the class more. I enjoy the class more. I've never had so much fun as giving the cheating test and watching everything happen in class and all the laughing and interacting and talking going on. It's fun. And they seem to come up with better answers, which seem to have required, back to the point about critical thinking, it seems to have required that they do that to get to those answers. And so, it's like, okay, this is what you have to do. And they're showing me that they can do it. So I'm very happy with the formats.
Excellent. We've got a question in the chat from Daniel Stanton. I don't know if you want to turn on your mic and ask it yourself, or no? Okay,
I can. It's fine. I just happened to take the break and went to the grocery store really quick, so apologies for the background noise. So I teach as an adjunct instructor for a community college that's an online kind of asynchronous course, but it has a portion of evolution in it for neurobiology and environmental biology, but it's not an evolution course. How can you best take these strategies and adapt them to work for maybe like a module or just for a short course?
So I can say something about this. Yeah. So we've got one of the people who teaches at MSU, teaches an intro bio for non-bio STEM majors. MSU requires all STEM majors to take one semester each of biology, chemistry, and physics. And prior to Louise developing this course, that meant we had a whole bunch of engineers taking cell and molecular biology for the pre-meds, which they hated. And so she has designed a course that does a general overview of biology, but doesn't go into the deep weeds on the cells and molecules. And therefore, she has more time to talk about evolution and ecology. And since her course doesn't have a physical lab room, she's set up the weekly recitation sections to run a virtual lab using this software. And we've got lesson plans up on our website for using this to show the random nature of mutation, some ecological interactions. So there are a number of other things that you can do with the software depending on what you need it for. So there are a lot of ways you can go depending on what you need to do, as long as you're willing to basically look through what are your learning objectives and what's an appropriate assessment that you'll take as evidence that students have met that objective, and then design your course to get them to that objective.
I would quickly say, in relation to the stuff that I was talking about, is that to answer your question, in some sense, you need to know what the overall class sizes is. So what I've done, I think scales up to 40. I've done it to like over 40 students in a class, probably 50, could get it to 60. But I've also taught introductory biology, to 300 people at once. And I don't think anything that I was doing, that I was suggesting would work very well in these sort of large classes. I think it would just kind of end up in a bit of chaos. In terms of online, I think that the biggest problem is how funky your technology is. Because again, I think something like what I call the cheating test could easily be done online if everybody has access, if everybody's Zoom works, if they can actually, interact with each other in some realistic way without their computers crashing and things like that. Because again, everybody's there, you give them a question, and now instead of, talking face to face, they're talking, across technology and internet, but it's the same idea. So I think it's definitely more challenging online because you have this technology between you and the students, and you're relying on how well that works. And I honestly can't say I didn't teach this class in this way when I was teaching online, and hopefully I never will have to. So I'm sorry that I can't sort of say, yeah, hey, no problem, it works. Depends on how well Zoom is doing these days.
Excellent. I think that's really useful. Thanks for raising that question, Daniel. It links to some questions that I had, and I hopefully we'll be able to circle back to some of this in the panel discussion at the end. I'm now going to pass over to Dula to introduce me.
Yes, so I can sort of say this person needs no introduction because you've been interacting with her for the past hour, but it's a pleasure to introduce my co-host and your next speaker, Dr. Claire Narroway. She's a science, policy, and innovation, and she's not in classical academia. She's at an organization called Earthwatch Europe, and she'll tell you about a project which we actually worked on together with a whole bunch of other people on promoting scientific literacy and evolution through citizen science. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dula. Yeah, so I was really lucky when I came back from UCLA to Europe. I got a job at an environmental NGO called Earthwatch Europe as a researcher. And they do citizen science there, and I really love the collaborative nature of citizen science as a discipline, but I was really missing my evolution hat and that aspect to my work. And I discovered Evoke, the Evoke conference there. That's where I met Dula and I met Tanya, and I joined the Eurocitizen Cost Action. And we've been working, we worked from January 2020 was when we had basically the kickoff meeting for this particular project in Berlin, all the way through the pandemic until we published, when we've been working together ever since then. And we've been working, not just Dula and I, but also with Miriam, Alexandra, Quentin, Till, and Tanya are the main, as sort of the main editing, all the first authors of this paper, and then many other members of the Cost Action, some of who are here today in generating this paper. And so, what we're trying to do is understand how you could promote scientific literacy and evolution through citizen science. So we've already heard some of this today. We noticed that sort of the problem or the opportunity that we saw is that evolution is generally quite poorly understood across society, but it's really important to solving a lot of societal issues. So things like climate change, selective breeding, genetic modification of crops, managing our health, and all of these different aspects, these societal issues. A good understanding of evolution really will support good societal decision making. And I'm preaching to a high choir here, but trying to solve these problems outside of the concepts of evolution really doesn't make sense. And so we really need to build this understanding of society. And what we think is that citizen science provides an excellent opportunity for people to learn at any stage in life, opportunity for learning about evolution. And it can happen at, and you can learn at any stage in life, and also that's also socio-demographic backgrounds, and you can learn informal education, informal education. And one of the great things about citizen science is it can be used in all of these different aspects, and through people at any stage in their lives can take part in citizen science and do take part in different citizen science projects. And it's very, very popular in the environmental sector as well. So there's already a lot of citizen science projects around sort of biodiversity and environmental issues. And some of them are the largest. You've probably all heard of eBird. You've probably all heard of iNaturalist. Some of the first ever citizen science projects were in ecology and biodiversity. So it really is like a really big opportunity here for there really should be quite a lot going on with evolution as well. However, when we looked at SciStarter, which is one of the biggest citizen science platforms out there, there were 1,587 projects listed on SciStarter, and we found about 40% of them were in the subject of ecology and the environment, but only about 3% of those actually related to the subject of evolution. And most of these topics, most of these topics in ecology and environment, when we actually scanned them that weren't mentioning evolution, could quite easily have built in some aspect of evolution education into them. And we're very aware that it's not actually easy necessarily to deal with evolution, and because there's many barriers that we need to be aware of and deal with when constructing citizen science projects or when constructing educational materials around evolution. And one of these is misconceptions. And there's all sorts of misconceptions. There's a whole long list of them. They're all over the place, and some of them are around like cute graphics like this, but that don't actually really relate to anything real, but we see them all the time in society. You see people walking around in t-shirts with this misconception all the time. And so a lot of them are really prevalent across society. There's also communication problems, particularly around the difference between colloquial use of language. So theory and colloquial use is sort of unsupported. It's a hypothesis, basically, whereas in science, when we say theory, we mean it's really well supported by evidence, and there's a lot of evidence backing that up. And there's also problems even communicating between scientists sometimes because of language barriers. So terms like fitness can be quite difficult to translate. For example, in Serbia, Dila told us, shows that when fitness is translated in Serbia, it's actually translated as adaptive value, and that's not really quite the same thing as fitness. And finally, the sort of cultural values, and this can go from religion, which can be a problem or not be a problem, to how educated people are, to socioeconomic status, and there's a huge number of cultural and socio-demographic reasons why people may find it a barrier to, or that may affect people's perception of evolution and how they're going to learn about it. And so all of these are going to affect how the citizen science project that's trying to teach evolution or teach about evolution is going to be constructed. And so we worked with quite a lot of education researchers as we developed this paper. And we came up with 4 key learning goals to improve scientific literacy in evolution. And some of them are going to be very obvious. So, for example, content knowledge, which is sort of about like key concepts, key ideas, sort of natural selection, adaptation, fitness, that evolution occurs over long periods of time, things like that. Key concepts need to be transmitted. People also need to understand procedural knowledge, and this is how do you collect data, how do you analyze it, how do you actually gain knowledge, how do you actually gain this knowledge in evolution, and how, despite evolutionary processes happening over timescales that we can't directly observe, do we build up an understanding and evidence base for evolution. Related to that is epistemic knowledge. It's a bit more subtle, though. It's more about the understanding of the nature of science and how scientific knowledge in general is produced. And it's really useful to help tackle misconceptions, particularly around debates over sort of new results that have just come out, which can sometimes be conflated with whether or not a theory like evolution actually happens, like natural selection actually happens, because a new result comes out over here. Whereas if you understand that scientific evidence is built up piece by piece by piece, and by the time something is a theory, you've got this massive body behind it, you understand that this one new piece of evidence here that's talking about a small subsection of evolution, and there's a debate there, it doesn't actually challenge evolution by natural selection as an overarching theory. And then you've got knowledge application, and this is being able to apply the knowledge that you've learned in a project back to a real world example or a different situation. And it's really important to developing and to showing that you have a deeper level understanding than just being able to sort of parrot back examples that someone has told you. And we think that all of these 4 learning goals are important, and all 4 of these learning goals can be taught and achieved through citizen science projects. So I'm now going to go through a few ways that you might be able to generate learning opportunities for evolution in citizen science projects as you establish them. So one quite in-depth and resource-intensive way is co-design process, and this can be a really great way of engaging participants who using it to sort of create a project that participants have an interest in, and so then keeping them engaged and for long term as well. And it has benefits, like if done well, that it could be more likely to be of interest to the participants, and then it'll be aligned with their priorities as well. And therefore, sort of, especially when you want to do a longer term project or something like that, you're more likely to keep that engagement. The most common way that citizens are engaged in citizen science projects is generally through data collection, analysis, and sort of understanding the nature of science, particularly data collection. And it's worth noting that citizen science projects can go all the way from sort of participants being basically like sensors and them not really engaging much, but just providing some computer power or something like that, through data collection and that sort of level of participation, sometimes analysis, all the way through to co-design, sometimes being PIs on the project, writing papers, and even applying for grants. So you can get this so there's a huge range of ways you can do a citizen science project, and it will depend on your audience, and you can use some or all or different methods, different types of these examples that I'm bringing up. Communication is going to be important in any citizen science project, really. It could be unidirectional, or it could be a dialogue situation, and it could be a conversation and communication between yourself as the researcher and the participants. That's going to have to happen, because otherwise you're not going to have any participants. But it can also be between the participants. So you can set up forums that allow participants to communicate and learn from each other. Although, of course, there you have to sort of be mindful of misconceptions, growing legs and running and running and running. But you can set up all of these great opportunities. And another one, it's not the final one, there are more, but gamification is a really fun way of getting people engaged. It's a really fun one to think about as well. How can I make this more engaging? How can I gamify it? How can I add this extra sort of layer of engagement value? But it's important when you gamify things to be careful not to oversimplify the information about evolution in games, because this can generate misconceptions. And so the output of our work was a paper, which I'm about to show you bits of, and we wanted to provide a kind of roadmap for evolutionary biologists, such as many of you, or citizen science professionals who want to make use of citizen science as a tool to conduct research and generate learning opportunities. And so we've made these 3 steps. We outline these 3 steps, and I also provide here some learning opportunities that you can see there. And we know this isn't a trivial matter. We're very aware of it. And so we really encourage you to go out and find a buddy, for example, an education scientist, and we're sure that many of them will be interested. We know many education scientists, they're all definitely interested. So go out and find a buddy. And it actually has a lot of co-benefit. There's a lot of co-benefits to using citizen science in your work, from opening up new streams of funding and publication opportunities by this collaboration with education scientists, or that the broader impacts, as I said, are becoming more and more a part of funding grants, and engaging the public is becoming more and more of a part of funding grants. So citizen science can be a great way of building that into your research. To allowing projects that just physically you wouldn't be able to perform without citizen science because of the complexities of data collection. So an example of this would be the Pieris project that looks at how organisms are responding to rapid changes in the environment caused by human activities. And they get participants to go out and collect the cabbage white butterflies and send them to the project where they sequence them and look at look for adaptations to different environments across in their genomes. And this happens both across a huge geographical area. The cabbage white butterfly is one of the most widespread butterflies in the world, and also over time, over years. And there's no way one researcher could go out and collect that many of cabbage white butterflies. It would just be too costly. No grant's ever going to fund it. You wouldn't have the time, etc. So it allows projects that can't happen to happen as well. And the last thing we say in this set that's really important is assess learning outcomes and start that very early from the beginning of your project. You can't really say much about the learning outcomes that you have unless you're assessing it. And so because this isn't a trivial matter, in the paper, we provide examples of ways that you can, of opportunities that you can use to promote learning on evolution in citizen science projects. We present tools that you can use to evaluate your citizen science projects. And so that it's easy for you to access the paper, here it is with a QR code. So if you want to do that, access that, or please feel free to contact Durla or myself or any of the other authors on the paper, and we'll be very happy to share it with you. It's all open access. I'd like to point out that this is a collaboration between 3 different cost actions. So in my introduction, I talked about cost actions. They're a European initiative to foster collaboration across Europe and build skills and stuff like that for researchers, and build opportunities and communicate and collaborative opportunities for researchers. And so I'd just like to thank you all for your attention, and that's me.
Thank you very much, Claire. It's great to revisit this work and hear about it from you again. We're a little bit ahead of time, but I don't think that's a huge problem. It just means that our next speaker will have a few extra minutes. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jolene De Lima, and sorry if I'm butchering the name, you'll correct it. And she has a double affiliation. One is our shared alma mater at Michigan State University in the United States, and the other one is the EPFL, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. Dr. Jolene will tell us about Exploring an Evolution exhibition. Why did they come? What did they do? What did they learn? So feel free to share your screen and go ahead whenever you're ready.
So I guess you're seeing my screen, and I hope it's all good.
Yes.
So hi everyone, I'm Jolene, and I think of myself both as a scientist and an educator, and I'm very passionate about science education and communication. And today I will be talking to you about evaluating an evolution-themed exhibition called Evolution Happens. Now, this was a temporary exhibition in the University of Zurich's Zoological Museum in Zurich, Switzerland, and was part of the outreach effort for a large multi-year grant that focused on evolution in action. Now, evaluations of this type not only allow you to understand the impact of your science communication and outreach, but also allow you to demonstrate accountability to your funders. So going in, so the exhibition itself was set up in a long room. This is the layout that you see here, and E marks the entrance. It had 7 stations, each focusing on a different case of evolution. So you had mice, crickets, anoles, triticale, antibiotics, pollinators, and Swiss ibexes. So we wanted to evaluate 3 main concepts, and we'll use stickiness as a loose analogy. So knowledge, engagement, and motivation. So we wanted to know which concepts stuck. So what did they learn and what surprised them? Which stations or activities were particularly sticky in terms of where did they spend their time and what did they spend it doing? And finally, here is where my analogy stretches a bit, but bear with me. Why was the exhibition sticky? So basically, what was their motivation? Why did they come there? So let's dive in straight away. Which concepts stuck? The data for this comes from a questionnaire that was given to two groups of people. One who went through the exhibition by themselves, so they were self-guided, and all this data was collected during one weekend. And the second group of people was those who went through the exhibition, but also got some additional input in the form of attending a workshop associated with the exhibition or a guided tour of the exhibition. And so the demographics of the people who completed the questionnaire are here, and we had a range of age groups, but most of the people were between 19 and 45. Between the two subgroups, there were some differences in the demographics, but not really a lot. So diving straight into what they learned, we asked them what did they learn at the particular exhibition. And their responses referred to all the 7 case studies that I'd mentioned to you before, but also to the overarching evolutionary concepts that the exhibition designers wanted to target. That is mutation, selection, and diversity. The concept of time with respect to evolution seemed to be the biggest takeaway, both in terms of evolutionary processes potentially happening very quickly or taking very long, or the fact that evolution does not really stop. In the two subgroups, there were some differences. People who had additional input mentioned evolution happening twice as quickly as those who were self-guided. And perhaps because this was an idea that was stressed during the tour. Ideas that appeared more frequently in people who walked through the exhibition by themselves included the role of animals on the evolutionary trajectory of other organisms, and that, most of the facts in the exhibition were already known to them. This is probably because there is some sort of a selection in the demographics of the people who actually choose to come to these exhibitions. When we asked them what surprised them, we see that the top 2 responses are probably ideas that they relate to the most. Antibiotic effect in their daily lives. They mentioned both the dangers of overuse as well as the amount of antibiotics that are used in Switzerland. And of course, they were very captivated and surprised about Swiss ibexes. In the two subgroups, there was not much of a variation. And some of the differences that we see could be either because of the focus of the tour or their own ramblings through the exhibition. When it comes to our second question, which activities were actually sticky, we will first focus on which of the stations were sticky. Now, this data is based on observing 20 people as they walked through the exhibition. We started observing them when they went in. We observed which order in which they went to the stations and how much time they spent there. So again, just to remind you, this is the layout of the 7 stations of the exhibition. And this is a GIF that shows the different paths that these 20 people took as they walked through the exhibition, from the moment they entered till the moment they left. Each color represents a different individual. And we see that people follow different paths and spend differing amounts of time at each station. There were 4 out of the 20 that went to all the 7 stations, and 3 people went to just 1 station before they left. So this has implications for the content and the activities of each stations and the relationships between the various stations, especially in terms of, do the stations build on each other or are they independent? For example, if people needed information from station 1 to understand station 2, there'd be a lot that they were missing here. So I'm just going to let the GIF play out. All right. We also kept tabs on how much time these 20 people spent there. And this varied between one person spending 45 minutes in the hall and 5 people just spending 2 minutes each. In total, these 20 people spent about 4.5 hours. And here the bubble size corresponds to the number of minutes per station out of this 4.5. And we see that it is almost evenly split between all the stations, except that they seem to spend very little time at the Anol and Tritikale station. Now, don't worry about the minutiae about what you see here. The size of each pie is the same as the previous graph, the total number of minutes that they spent there. And in each pie, each wedge tells you the amount of time any given person spent there. What I basically want you to see is that both the colors in each pie are different and the size of the wedges for any color is not constant. So people did not divide their time proportionately between the stations. Now, the next thing that we looked at is the activities. So each station, there were multiple activities that you could do. And this is a different data set, also based on observations. And to gather this data, we observed the people who visited any one station. So imagine I was observing the mice station. I would observe that a person has come here, say, at 6 p.m. Then I would note down what the person did the whole time they were there, which activities they engaged with, and I would note the time that they left. Then I would observe the next person. So what we found is that the time people spent at any one station ranged between a minute to about 15 minutes. And most people spent less than 5 minutes at any given station. This shows you the average amount of time spent by these people at any of these stations. And it seems like they spent a lot of time at the antibiotic station and the least amount of time at the stations relating to anoles and ibexes. As I said, there were multiple activities that they could do at any of the given stations, and what they did choose to do varied. So reading was the most frequently observed activity, and we see this at almost every station, followed by physically interacting with aspects of the exhibit. The antibiotic station and pollinator station, people watched the videos a lot, and they listened to the audios at the mice, triticale, and the antibiotic station. However, there seemed to be something about the ibex and pollinator stations that encouraged people to actually discuss it with their companions. Finally, we come to the last question. Why did they come here? What was their motivation? And this data comes from the same questionnaire that you saw before. And we see that most of them came there because they were genuinely interested, either in science or nature or evolution. A lot of them came because there was an organized group going to the exhibition. This is both for professional reasons, so a course requirement or a school field trip, but also for social reasons. There was a club outing that happened at the same time. We also see a lot of them came because they were participating in another event that was simultaneously happening. So that weekend was also the long night at the weekend in Zurich, but also was a science festival. And coincidence and word of mouth played a great role in bringing people here. Between the two groups, genuine interest is something that is in common. They came there because they were interested. Whereas for the self-guided people, many of them came there because they were coming there anyway for another event, or for the guided, for the people who had additional input, they came because there was something organized over there. So to sum it up and to think about what lessons we can draw from here, basically when we think about knowledge, well, they didn't learn what we wanted them to learn. At least they remembered what we wanted them to learn, including the targeted concepts and the 7 case studies. There were some differences that we noticed between people who had additional input or not. And we saw that some of the ideas that stuck the most were concepts related to the daily lives of the local population. And this is a major focus of the theory of place-based education, which looks at improving learning outcomes by making education more relatable and relevant, by setting it in ideas about the place that they're most familiar with. When it comes to engagement, the big takeaway we had was that the amount of time alone does not predict learning. So although there isn't a perfect overlap between the people who filled the questionnaire and the people who observed, we noticed an interesting trend. So people spent a lot of time at the antibiotic stations, and ideas relating to antibiotics appeared very frequently in the responses to what they had learned. Similarly, very little time at the pollinator station, this idea appears infrequently in their responses. However, they seem to have spent a lot of time at the triticale station, but this idea appears very infrequently. And in contrast, even though they spend very little time at the ibex station, that is an idea that seems to have stuck with them, and multiple people spoke about it in their knowledge questionnaire. We also noticed that people went to stations in different orders, spent different amount of time, and engaged in different activities over there. And as I said earlier, if the stations were meant to build on the previous, then people would be losing a whole lot of information. And additionally, since they didn't engage in all the activities at each station, redundancy in the way information is provided is very important, especially for the key points that you want them to go away with. And finally, when it comes to motivation, well, coincidence is an amazing thing. So if you can have your exhibit at a place where something else is already happening, good job. Some of the differences that we see in motivation could be because of, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation that people have. And so while you are designing your exhibition, appeal to the intrinsically motivated, but also incentivize the extrinsically motivated. So for me, science communication is a blending of art and science. And since I cannot draw or sing to save my life, I choose to express my art through poetry, specifically haikus. And this has become something of a tradition for me to wrap up my talks with a related haiku. And so here is my haiku for today. Did you know, my dear, evolution happens, yeah, all around you too. And to wrap it up, I would like to say thank you to the people who were involved in this work, which was quite a lot. We needed an army of volunteers to collect all the observational data that I spoke to you about. We also had lots of help from people with translations, with actually doing the tours, with some data analyses and transcriptions, and this amazing team of 3 women who helped me develop and bring this project to fruition. And so to end, in the words of my people, Deo Bareng Karo.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. I learned a lot, and it was fun also to see some familiar faces towards the end. We have a lot of common colleagues. So we now have a block of time dedicated to questions to Jolene and to Claire. So I invite you all to, I see Peter.
Yeah, this is, I guess it's 2-part. One sort of, I think, more specific to Claire, and then I think the other part was more general to literally everyone who's presented and everyone who's listening, which is when you were searching, the various kind of websites and science, you can go look at science. One of the things that evolution faces is that there are actually websites that are anti-evolution, that are basically putting out, intelligent design or creationist kind of arguments. And my specific question is, how many did you run into those? And if so, how many sites are out there that are talking about evolution, but are basically anti-evolution? And the more general question is, given that there are organizations and people that are specifically, let's say, charitably putting out misinformation about evolution, do we actually want to engage or debate those people, those sites, or does that just sort of give them more credibility? And we should just, as this symposium is done, is just present all the positive aspects of evolution and just hopefully, educate people about it rather than confront the misinformation. Thank you.
So shall I just address the first part of Peter's question? That's right to me. So we did a scan of some citizen science platforms. SciStarter is the one that we presented data on, but we also looked at a few others. And so there we didn't find evidence of sort of misinformation about evolution on those platforms. Those platforms are basically hosting citizen science projects. As you can see, very few of them specifically mentioned or spoke to evolution. And citizen science is trying to address, each citizen science project is trying to address its own question, its own research question. And so for many of them where we see opportunity for biodiversity ones and things like that is around sort of having some sort of educational module around evolution on their platform, mentioning how it's related to the topic. And then we see a huge opportunity to create more evolution, more projects for evolution researchers and education scientists to collaborate and generate more more projects and more research projects in evolution. I think this actually has a really great opportunity to address some of these misconceptions and things like that, because it's a really hands-on, active way of learning. It's a really engaging way. Some people just go out and collect data and don't really engage with researchers, but they might be getting newsletters or things like that. They might engage in conversations across platforms. They might be engaging in conversations with researchers. And as a researcher, you can actually, your team can, if you have an online forum where you're allowing participants to collaborate, you do basically have to moderate that platform to ensure that sort of misinformation or that people, but just in general, people aren't being rude to each other or something like that. And it doesn't happen very often. It's not an onerous task. You're not regularly dealing with that sort of stuff, but you do have to be over those. So there is a time element to that. So I think it's a really good opportunity and a good way and an interesting way of sort of inviting people to learn about evolution without it sort of in a way that would maybe some, like going to a course on evolution, they might not want to do that, it might put them off, but sort of being involved in a project and sort of collecting data and getting out into the world and all going and interacting with nature might be sort of really big motivators for people to go out and engage in a project, and they might then get some of this evolution education knowledge without sort of necessarily going out and seeking it. So I think there's a really nice way of addressing some of these misinformation, these opportunities for people that
So if I can jump in here for a moment, one of the things I think on your second question about whether you specifically address the misconceptions, it depends heavily on what your context is. So there's been a lot of work in the pedagogical research literature showing that in a formal classroom setting, you shouldn't just assume that your students are taking in the things you say without having a background at all. Even if students are completely wrong on what they think is happening, they're going to try to build the new information you give them on top of the foundation of whatever it is they think they know ahead of time. And so you have to actually explicitly address misconceptions, or else students are going to continue to hold that misconception and try to warp what you are teaching them to fit with that. Now, in an informal education setting, like we've done, elementary school science nights or classroom visits for a 20-minute session, that's a very different environment. And so knowing your audience and knowing what the expectations are on level of engagement, time involved, is going to strongly influence whether you address a particular misconception or if you're more just trying to capture their interest and make them aware that this is a topic that they can go learn more about.
There is a hand from Hagar.
Yep, so I have a question for Jolene. So when you design an exhibition like the one that you did, and you have multiple stations, and you want to measure engagement, so how do you account for the complexity of ideas that could be simple in one station, but a little bit more complicated at the other? Because ideally we want them, because I was wondering, could somebody be more engaged in one station because it's a little bit more difficult to understand than others? Is this something that can affect the design a little bit?
Thanks, Hagar. That's a cool question. So the disadvantage of this evaluating this exhibition from my viewpoint was I was not involved in the design. When you, so the best way would be to have assessment and evaluation intertwined with the design of your informal activity. And that's when you know what your learning goal is, how you are testing it, and then you can design the activity in order to get that information. However, the exhibition was already designed and it was already there. I went in post that and then tried to figure out how to assess it. Now, this particular exhibition the way it was designed was the same ideas and the same concepts were basically repeated 7 different times using 7 different case studies, but to highlight how you see the same concept and you see the same ideas in different people's research, some of them highlighting the research that's happening here, but some of them highlighting the global research. There was, of course, some differences in, the lengths of videos available or the actual tactile thing that they could do for various things. There was some differences there. And so that could cause a difference in how long people actually choose to be there. And so, yeah, so just like the time they spent there might not really tell you anything much, which was one of the big takeaways we took, which is that just because they spend more time doesn't mean that they're learning more about it. And because they spend less time doesn't mean that they're not learning about it. But in general, what I would advise is if you are going to do some outreach, when you start designing your outreach, design how you're going to assess it and intertwine those 3 things together.
If I could follow up on that question, Jolene, what was going on at that IBEX station? Because it looked like people spent less time there than they did most of the other places, but they really got involved in the conversations and they cited it as really interesting. Like, what were they doing at that station?
Nothing much different, basically, but it's the idea of Swiss IBEXs. So if you're not familiar with the Swiss IBEXs, so the Swiss IBEX was extinct in Switzerland. There were no IBEXs in Switzerland. So what they decided was, okay, we're going to have IBEXs. And so they just basically brought IBEXs from across the Alps. So from Italy, they just took a population and they brought them here. What they did not account for was inbreeding, because this was just one population. And so there was a lot of inbreeding. And now this population is having a lot of difficulties, especially with regards to their skeletal structure, and is in big problems. And so now there's a big debate in the Swiss community about bringing more IBEXs from different populations so that there is some genetic diversity happening there. And so this is a conversation that is happening in the public and is something very iconic, because the Swiss, like, these are our IBEXs. We have like 2 mountain goats. We have the chamois and the IBEXs, and these are ours. And so, there is this thing about national pride as well. And so when you tug into all these other emotional threads, you don't really need to do a lot of teaching. You already, it's already exciting for them.
There is a heart. I don't know if that's it's a wish to ask a question, or it's from Orlando. Okay, heart went away, but there is a hand from Daniel. Go ahead, Daniel.
Hey guys, great discussion. I just want to tag on to just again my opinion on this situation. I think there's a really great saying by Jack Hanna that to touch the heart is to teach the mind. And I think what you're talking about is maybe what's happening at that station is that when you pull on the heartstrings, you pull on that feeling. The lesson just gets hammered home in a different way than, say, one of us, lecturing in front of a class, just spelling out facts about evolution. And I think that, one thing to not really, I want to underscore this, but like one thing not to forget about this conversation is I think it's how we talk about things, not always what we talk about. And I think that if we really want to impart knowledge, we have to connect with our audience, whether that be undergrads, whether it be citizen science or whatever it is. But as you guys were talking, that quote kind of came to mind. And I think that, the difference between something succeeding or failing could be in the delivery itself. And so I just wanted to bring that point up. Do you guys have any additional pieces of advice that you found helpful to really connect an audience that may be one of those audiences that you thought would be a difficult audience? Or say, not to try to draw a line here, but, we have plenty of people that can believe in both, have faith and believe in science and believe in evolution. You have people that are completely anti that and will tell you that you're just, an idiot or whatever. I don't know. But how do you best connect with an audience that you're having a hard time, that is resistant or doesn't want to connect with you? I guess that's how I can take what I was saying and turn it and flip it into a question.
Anyone who feels like answering?
I'll take a shot at that.
Sure.
So for me, the important thing to capture, like you said, the heart, and is not to set them up that I want to disagree with my students or whoever, the general public. Because most people approach these things by, no, you're wrong, we're right, this is what the fact is. And that immediately create barriers rise up and nobody will listen at all. So the idea to me is always that I want to listen to you. I want to hear your argument and let them speak, let them spill out. And when people talk and talk and talk and talk, and then they feel relaxed, they've been heard, then you can start thinking, okay, well, how about this? Or why that? And you start probing to help them come up with an answer to your questions rather than the other way around. I thought when I use that, it's very, very helpful because people start to trust you. They start to let down their barriers, which in any argument, this is not just about evolution, but in general, even in everyday life. So that's one approach I use. And the other thing, especially if you're talking about a religious community, I tell them that actually understanding evolution brings me closer to my faith. And for many, that was a surprise because in their mind that this is such an alienating concept for faith. And for me to tell them the opposite was kind of like contradictory to what they believed. And it caused them to pause and wait a minute, well, how would that work? And that allows for, some doubt that would allow for a little bit of independent thinking. So to me, those are two approaches that I have found very useful.
I would like to add to what Rana said, especially when it comes to faith and questions about evolution and faith. I think one of the things that has helped me most talk to Christians or other Catholics about evolution is I'm a Catholic, I have faith, but I know what the teachings of my religion are. I have read all the doctrines and I have taught Sunday school for 10 years. So I know the theology and the doctrines of the church back and forth. And so I know what is happening and what the religion actually teaches you rather than what you think is happening. And so I can then argue from a position of I'm an authority on religious matters because I know what the religion actually is telling you and what the tenets of the religion are rather than what you think they are.
I also personally think it's quite useful to remove the expectation that you're going to change someone's mind or that you're going to hear from them, oh wow, light bulb moment, like evolution's right, I never thought it was. Like, just remove that expectation. What you're doing is you're presenting, and you can only control how the way you present information, and you can try and relate it to their motivations, and you can try and understand the barriers to them participating in your class or your project or your citizen science project, whatever it is, and try and reduce those barriers. But all you're otherwise trying to do is just by presenting your information, just pushing the jaw jar a little bit. So when they then encounter that same information or information that's akin to that information, they're slightly more open to it, and they're slightly more open to it again. And over time, hopefully then eventually they encounter that information enough times and it builds on it enough times that they have that light bulb moment. But you're very unlikely ever to hear it, so just get rid of that expectation.
It has come up in a lot of the pedagogical research that students will interpret silence about a topic as hostility towards that topic. And so a lot of faculty who are teaching evolution try never discussing anything about faith because they figure they are not an authority on that topic. And so they shouldn't really be discussing it. And they perceive not engaging in a topic that they don't see themselves as an expert about as being very neutral on that topic. But that's not how a lot of students interpret it instead. So I will take the very short amount of time to explain that, I am here to teach you science. And science is mostly concerned about what will or will not happen and how it will or will not happen. But it doesn't always have a lot to do about the why. It has much more to do about the how and the what. I also do have a colleague who, I don't do this myself, but he chooses very early on in his class as an assignment to get all of the students to find the formal doctrine of their faith in regards to evolution. And a large percentage of students come into the class believing that their official doctrine is going to be anti-evolution, and it's not for most students. Even within a US culture with a high degree of evangelical Christians, most of the mainline Protestant denominations do not actually have any explicit rejection of evolution. And in fact, not only do the Catholics, but a couple of the mainline Protestants have an explicit acceptance of this in their formal church doctrines. Now, part of the reason why I don't do that is I do not want to have an assignment specifically about faith among my students. And also with the class sizes I teach, I can guarantee you that there are some students for whom there is actually an official church doctrine against it. And so I would rather not activate that in my set of students, but I do feel it's worth taking the couple of minutes to discuss the issue. In general, people who reject evolution, it's not that they don't know the information, it's not a deficit model of education, it's that they are embedded within a culture that they perceive as being in conflict with the science, and their cultural ties are much more immediate and more important to them than these abstract notions of what's going on with the science. And so just giving them the information itself is not going to move them very far. But they will move a little further if you explicitly tell them, we're just trying to predict what happens and come up with an explanation of how that happens and not concern ourselves with the why.
There's a hand from Daniel.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for the discussion. I wasn't trying to take it towards the religious angle, but I'll be honest, in both of my classes, I deal with this more in discussions, and I try to grade for completion discussion, not their responses. But I see this all the time. This is topic number one, and then topic number two is animal rights. Like, a lot of people have all these feelings that are really misplaced because, and I'm dare I say, social media has not exactly helped us in these areas. That they have all these misnomers. And so I just kind of wanted to ask that question because I appreciate what you guys are saying, because I'll be honest, since it's a general biology course, I kind of shy away from being, one way or another, and just let my students decide for themselves and say, hey, look, I'm presenting this information, you're being tested on this information, and this is a way to measure, change over time and what we understand in terms of science. And I leave it there. I try not to, I'm not trying to necessarily offend anybody or not offend anybody. But there are some days, I'll be honest, this is as an educator who's also a PhD student, who also does a bunch of other stuff. It gets a little daunting because you're sitting here reading these discussions, you're thinking to yourself, that's so off base, but yet you also don't want to attack it 100% in something like a general biology course. Now, if I'm teaching evolution, maybe I might have, more, encouragement to do so. So I appreciate the conversation. I apologize if I was going to gone a little bit more evolution versus religion, because that's not really was my intention. But I love the feedback. And it seems like you guys have some of the same problems as I do with students, or, how do you tweak that thinking without offending anybody? Because I don't want to offend my students, but at the same time, it's important that they understand the concepts, not only for tests, but say, hey, this is a science class. You're taking a science class. I love what my former advisor said in one of my classes. He said, I'll teach you all about evolution. If you want to know about God, you can come to my Sunday school class. And I love that dichotomy, but we live in a society that tries to put everything in boxes. And the reality is that religion and, science is not exactly, they're not diametrically opposed, but they're also not, they're complete separate directions of thinking in a way. And so sometimes people try to relate something in one area to another area without fully understanding the other area. So I love the feedback and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Daniel. So for those of you who haven't noticed, we moved into kind of a broader discussion. It came very naturally. That's fantastic. This is exactly kind of what Claire and I were hoping was going to happen. I have a question that I'm curious. We talked about sort of formal and informal education. Someone mentioned COVID very early on. And so from the perspective of teaching about science and teaching about evolution, this was a huge scientific discussion that happened over the past several years, the likes of which I at least don't remember when was the last time that as the general public talked science so much and talked about some of the concepts that are very evolutionary. So we talked about resistance, we talked about immunity or development of, there were all sorts of things. So I'm curious, do you see that that has changed something in the way you teach evolution? Has that helped? Has that hurt? Has that, are students reacting differently? Is the general public now behaving differently in some way because of all the science talk that happened around COVID?
I'll start. I think I mentioned it in my talk because I was invited multiple times to speak about, where did COVID come from because of all the, conspiracy theories and all that, which regardless whether we agree or disagree, still evolution is part of what's happening in terms of the evolution of the different various virus variants and so on. So actually it was a very good opportunity to engage with the public and explain in more detail. So I think it raised the scientific awareness in the general population and people got more curious. Now, whether, again, I'm speaking to a Muslim community population where I think it became more in the general discussion, brought it up. I don't know how much it pushed it. But I think these things take time to change, as was mentioned earlier. However, I think all in all, it was good. If we can say anything good came out of COVID.
I would actually have the flip. Oh, sorry, Peter.
Go ahead.
So my experience is the flip one, which is I think COVID did a lot to damage evolution perception and evolution education. And it's coming from India, where because of all the extra pressures associated with COVID, there were many topics of concepts that were sort of removed from the curriculum for students because they're like, okay, there's already so much happening. You don't need to study all this. Let's just remove some of this. And now that removal has become permanent and evolution has been permanently removed from a lot of our school curricula in India, which is actually quite frightening and scary. And everybody in India, like the scientific community is like, what is this bullshit? But that's what's happening.
So I'll maybe say something a little more positive. That's kind of scary. Yes. Because of COVID, there's a first year freshman seminar series run at UCLA, and I did one on the evolution of viruses, which was quite apropos because of COVID, right? So, but that allowed me to bring in evolutionary things like fossil viruses, like humans and chimpanzees have viral genes in the same place in our genomes, and gorillas don't. Wow, how did that happen? And you could bring in evolutionary evidence because you're talking about viruses, and where did they come from? Were they there 4 billion years ago when cells were evolving? What was going on? And to your point, again, there was a lot more questions about how do viruses evolve? Where did they come from? Was it a lab leak? Was it from an animal vector? How would we know one way or the other, kind of thing? And all those are very evolutionary questions. And then because this was a freshman kind of class, actually religion came into it too, which is is there any morality to the world? Why is this awful thing killing millions of people? What does that mean? And you start to talk about, well, evolution is not a moral or immoral process. It's an amoral process, and things happen because they're selected, not because they're good and they're bad. So we had a discussion about morality in evolution and lack thereof. And you do kind of at some point have to open yourself up. And so unlike some of the other speakers here, obviously I'm an atheist, but I'm not there to proselytize and say, okay, well, you have to leave your faith because, you know, I left mine because it didn't make sense to me, but that's your choice. And we can still discuss, you know, what happened, where viruses came from and what they're doing and everything with, you know, doesn't matter what religion you are or whether you have no religion, you can still discuss this in a very civil, interesting way. And so that was a very interesting set of classes, I think, that that sort of came up with your question of, well, science is now more interesting because of COVID. Yes, that class was certainly more interesting.
So I had a mixed bag reaction from some of my students. So I am an evolutionary biologist. I teach molecular biology more often than I teach evolutionary biology, just because we have more need for that in my unit and we have fewer people who have the training for it. So on the one hand, you know, I definitely had many more people interested in why changes in particular amino acids would lead to differences between how tightly things would interact with each other. Early on in the pandemic, it made it pretty easy as I started bringing up, like, here are spike protein mutations and how well will this thing bind to a receptor. Students were a lot more interested in that than they normally are. On the other hand, at least within the US, the reaction to COVID has been so incredibly politicized that students are reacting to molecular biology as a much more political subject than they were 3 years ago. Like 3 years ago, I didn't have to worry about what their political ideology was when I was trying to explain how proteins fold. And now I'm finding that I have a certain percentage of students that are willing to just basically write off almost all of science as a particular political ideology and worldview that conflicts with what they think things should be. So I've seen more interest in certain parts that have become more relevant, but the entire concept of science has become more political for a certain percentage of the students, and that makes some of them just ignore it entirely.
Thanks, Mike. Do we have more questions? I can keep going. So I wanted to ask you all something else. You all talked in different ways about innovative methods, and this was sort of the running theme of the symposium. And you all know best that it's not easy to come up, to introduce, to work with innovative methods in teaching of evolution or in any teaching really. So what would you say to a colleague who is a bit skeptical and who just doesn't have time to invest in this, or things that they don't have time to invest in this? How do you motivate others to do something different?
I think I'm quite well positioned to answer that, because my day job is a pedagogical advisor, and I have to convince university teachers to actually use these new methods of pedagogy in their classes. And what works is, for university teachers at least, is evidence. If I'm just saying, I feel this is better and I think that is better, that's not going to work. And so all my workshops and everything are based on evidence. So I will give them studies, I will give them data, I will give, I will talk from evidence, and I'm always quoting from different studies, and specifically that are relevant to what they are teaching. So if they are teaching math at the undergraduate level, I will show studies that have been done on math students rather than on biology students. So it's saying, like, yeah, because otherwise the conversation might be, yeah, it works for those biologists, it doesn't work for us. I'm like, no, this works in your situation. And there are situations wherein you don't have those studies, and that's when you go in and fill the gap and you do those studies to help the next generation of teachers.
Thank you. Rana?
I took your question in a different way. What I understood is, why would I care? I'm just teaching biology. Why should I go into this whole rabbit hole of evolution? Yeah, to me, no, it is worthwhile because it's not about evolution. It's about teaching them critical thinking skills, and not just to take things for granted or what they heard or what they, what they read somewhere. To give them that feeling of agency that I have a mind, I can think on my own. Education, unfortunately, has been a lot more regurgitation. I memorize and I take an exam, and that's what matters. And I think this is an opportunity for the instructor, teacher, whatever, to give a chance for a student to think on their own, and how fun that is, because it gives you that feeling of agency. I think Peter mentioned it in his class. Students have fun. So it's worthwhile if that educator, and I'm assuming that educator really cares, and he cares about the student, not cares about the concept of convincing or not. So it's not about that. It's about honing those critical skills. And to me, that's the whole objective of education itself.
Would you say that there is more opportunity to talk about critical thinking, more agency when talking about evolution than say talking about molecular biology? And if so, why?
Well, because oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, well, quickly, just very quickly. I think it depends on the topic. I mean, you can, in evolution is wonderful. You can ask these very open-ended questions that could be answered in any number of ways, and they're all good answers. If you're teaching sort of a mathematics class and, you have to, derive or integrate something, there's a right answer and everything else is wrong, and so it kind of depends on that. Yeah. And I've said evolution and the other class I teach, animal behavior, are wonderful because you've got all these crazy, wonderful examples you can toss in that are just cool, and people will get excited about it. But so that's our advantage. Is it's intrinsically an interesting thing, even without the theory and without the math and everything that you can build on. So that's my advantage. That's what works for me.
I was just going to add that it's an opportunity for students to speak instead of just sitting in class, to offer an opinion, and not just think it through on the students' side of the, let's say, enjoyment, but also they get to speak, they get to engage, they get to dialogue, which doesn't always happen in a science class. If you haven't prepared, like the facts, what are you going to say in class? But this doesn't have to do with the preparing. It's about, okay, what's your background? What have you been thinking? How do you go about this, etc. And that's the first step in learning critical thinking, is to form an opinion.
So as someone who teaches on both sides, we actually do a lot of critical thinking, molecular biology as well. It depends a lot on how you structure our classes. And all of our intro classes are pretty much all flipped classroom. There are some pre-recorded lectures for them to watch before they come to class, and we'll go through 10 minutes or so of a recap of things, maybe ask some polling questions. And then they're working in activities for groups of 4 or 5 students for the majority of the class period. And then we've got some more polling questions for them at the end. And so with molecular biology, we'll do a lot of things of like, okay, so you've got this compound, and imagine you're going to remove this functional group and put on this other one. And now what's going to happen to the molecule, and therefore what's going to happen to what will bind to it, and will this make things more or less effective? There are still right answers, but there's a whole critical reasoning pathway. Same way we teach signal transduction pathways, and we teach the logic of like, okay, this thing activates this one activates this one. I make a drug, and this drug interferes with this step. So what do you end up with higher concentrations of? What do you end up with lower concentrations of? And they're not going to have the answer to that in a book anywhere. And they're not going to be able to find that easily from a Google search. But if they have learned the concept, they can reason their way through it quite simply. It does take a lot more work to teach this way. It would be much less work for me to show up and lecture for 80 minutes about a particular topic. And the other thing, like Jolene said, we do present this data to the other faculty, and that does get us some buy-in from the faculty. But we also try presenting some of this data to the students of like, the reason you are doing this is because these tests show you will learn better if you do this. They also show you think you will learn more from a lecture, but that's not actually true. And it turns out the students aren't great at believing the data that we give them. The faculty member is generally a little bit better.
Just
Go
to
ahead,
add to
Rana.
what I just want to add what you said, Mike. I tell my students that I teach you exactly the way you said, problem-based learning, right? Throw a problem and let them figure it out. And I tell them when you go and after you graduate and you find a job, you're not going to sit in a job where somebody gives you a multiple choice question, choose the right answer. You have to think it through. And if you're not learning how to think it through in my class, you're not going to do well later when you graduate, and nobody's going to employ you. And so that kind of perks them up and say, okay, let me learn how to problem solve and do that so I can, land a better job or do better at my job.
Claire?
I actually took the question much more like Jolene, but I also think it works really well with what you're saying now, is that it's all about linking to the person's motivation. So you're just talking about how do you link this to the students' motivations? How do you make them want to learn? How do you encourage them to think critically? How do you encourage them to engage in the material in the way that you want them to, and therefore learn the subject matter? And for professors who are busy, or for teachers, like we do a lot of work with school teachers in the UK, and they are so busy. They don't have, they're like time is just a nightmare for them. So understanding the barriers to taking up these different methods, and also aligning it to their motivation. So for researchers, that's often access to funding or publications or things like that. And more we're seeing sort of the broader impacts of engagement, or evaluating learning and showing those broader impacts that you can have as being key to funding. Also, if you can link your research to your education in some way, like you can do with citizen science, or you could do in other ways in the lab or something like that, then you can then sort of get funding for that one piece of research from two different sources, from an education source if you're evaluating it as well, because you can also fund the research within some of those grants, and then also from the research, and then you're supporting the evaluation as well. So if you build that in, so I think like linking it to people's motivations, and then understanding the barriers to them taking up these things, and then just trying to make that as easy as possible, and reducing the barriers as much as possible is the key.
Thank you. We are 2 minutes away from the end of this. Anybody have any quick questions, thoughts, things they would like to share before we start wrapping up?
I'd like to add something. So I gave my talk about my population, what I teach. However, when I'm teaching outside the Arab Muslim world, let's move religion out of the way. The way I get my students engaged is I encourage them to read novels. I call it novel reading for novel learning. That's a pun on the word novel. And so, so it's a science fiction book. Like, I don't know if anybody's read Darwin's Radio or Upgraded, or so Greg Bear and all his novels. So I tell my students, read it, and then let's have a discussion. Go check, can that really happen? So it makes them read the textbook to double check, is this possible? And then engage in a discussion of, could that be the next step of evolution or not? So it gets them excited because it's a thriller, it's an adventure. And at the same time, it's their problem based. They have to figure out, is this real or not? And so on.
Cool.
My final takeaway would be, if you guys are designing any science outreach and science communication, please evaluate them, please assess them, and build that in. I've just put in a link that in the chat that shows you some of the thoughts processes we went through when we were designing two different evaluations.
All right. If those were your last things, I was going to ask one last question, but I think we're good, and I think it's a nice place to stop. So on from me, I want to thank you all for being here, both the speakers and the participants. It was a fun way to spend a Sunday afternoon in my time zone, or Saturday afternoon, sorry, in my time zone. Not what I usually do, but it's been fantastic. I want to give the word also to Claire as a co-organizer. Any last words from you?
Just to second what you've said, thank you so much to the speakers. It's been brilliant, and thank you so much to all the participants and your great questions. I've really enjoyed this. So thank you.